Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty good for a self-employed yoga teacher.
Hey,
How you
funny you
doing?
should mention that because we're going to talk about yoga, Josh. But first, let me tell people who you are. You're Josh Summers. People may have seen you on meaningoflife.tv or listened to you on the meaningoflife.tv audio podcast, and they may not have. So let me introduce you a little. You are a yoga teacher. And we're going to talk about yoga. We're also going to talk about mindfulness and the connection between yoga and mindfulness and the connection between yoga and meditation. Like, is yoga really spiritual or is it just exercise or what? Buddhism, Hinduism, how do they connect, if at all? We're going to straighten it all out. We're even going to talk about mindful resistance, which is something I'm involved with, having launched the Mindful Resistance newsletter. We're going to talk about that near the end. But first, I should say that in addition to being a contributor to Meaning of Life TV and a yoga teacher, you are someone that I met at the first meditation retreat I ever did in 2003, the Insight Meditation Society. I met you at the end after the silence was broken. And then weirdly, I didn't do another retreat for like 6 years. And my next one was in 2009, and I show up and there you were again. You must go to a lot of retreats.
I had been going to a lot of retreats back then.
You've lapsed.
I've lapsed a little bit. I'm not as into it.
How many retreats of a week or longer have you done?
Bob, that's putting me on the spot. That's getting into spiritual materialism.
Are you embarrassed by the number of retreats?
Well, no.
Done?
If I say how many retreats I've done, that will sort of counteract any benefit that I would have had from the retreats of whittling down my ego. So it's a big number. Is that what you're telling us? It's a trap. It's a trap. You're setting me up for a trap.
So it sounds like you've just acknowledged that it's a big number.
I think I was going to ask you about the time we met too, because this was an interesting moment when the retreat had ended.
Sounds to me like you're changing the subject, but go ahead.
I am changing the subject. I'll come back in a second. But the retreat had ended, and as listeners probably know, people have been practicing in silence for roughly 8 or 9 days, intensively. And I had no idea who you were. And suddenly this looming kind of, how tall are you, 6'4", 6'5"?
No, it's an optical illusion. I'm 5'2".
Because you're so skinny?
Something. I don't know what it is, but people overestimate. The tallest I've ever been was 6'1.5", and that was in high school. I've probably shrunk. But anyway.
Well, anyway, you were looming down on me, and you kind of came at me saying, is this your rookie season? And
Did I say that?
That was your exact words. Is this your rookie season? And again, I still had no idea who you were. And we sat down for lunch, and we started having a conversation. And you bore into me with, rapid fire questions.
I have a way of doing that. I'm sorry.
Right. Anyway, since subsequent to that, became a big fan of yours. So it was.
I encourage that. This is my technique. I drill into people with a bunch of questions, and then by the end, they're
impress them with the fortitude of the questions.
Yeah,
and then
this is my fan base. It's not the most efficient way to build up a base, but door to door. I just literally go door to door in my neighborhood. So
to your other question, I think at one point, because I had to qualify for a brain scan study with Judd Brewer, I added up.
Famous. He's done important studies.
He has done important studies.
Were you part of the study that Gary Weber was part of?
No. That was in Yale. I was in a beta test done at the UMass Center, and I don't think I scored very well. I don't think I was.
Now that's what you shouldn't be. That's the way you shouldn't be talking. That's much worse than telling me how many meditation retreats you've done. Is to say I didn't do very well.
Well, I found problems in the study. This is beyond maybe more than we want to get into, but I found problems in the parameter of the study. The kinds of instructions they were asking you to do, like focus on crosshairs on the screen and focus on your breath, simultaneously seemed divergent from what the meditation practice was about.
Absolutely.
So it was a little bit strange.
Anyway,
so I've done it, like, let's say I did 2 or 3 retreats a year for a number of years.
Wow.
Does that satisfy you?
That's serious. So you're pretty close to enlightenment. Good. We need, because then you can illuminate things about yoga.
Well, no, I don't think I'm close to enlightenment, but I think, back to our meeting, I think I fooled you. Because the fact that you came to me at the end of that retreat, I think I had exuded a certain degree of
As I recall, I fooled you. I think you're the person I remember saying that I had looked like a veteran to you. But maybe
you did.
Not.
You did have that look.
I had the look. It was my first retreat, and yet I had the look down already. The veteran look.
Sorry for my dogs.
Okay, we like dogs. Last thing I taped, we had Andrew Sullivan's dog actually pee on the rug. That was one of the highlights. And we didn't get it on camera, regrettably, but we got Andrew screaming at the dog.
Well, I'm not going to scream at my dog because I have...
Because you are so close to enlightenment, which brings us to yoga.
I can resist that urge.
Yeah, exactly.
To scream. Yeah.
Resist is not, as you know, it's not quite the word. You hold the feeling mindfully.
And don't act upon it. We're getting somewhere. So what do you want to know about yoga, Bob?
So, okay, I do have all these questions about yoga. Like, should I be doing it, for example? And I had this totally false, view of it, I'm sure, as being kind of fundamentally physical. I mean, not that everything isn't according to a certain way of thinking, but, kind of a form of exercise, stretching, make your body super supple, and yes, sure, maybe you calm down in the course of it, but I hadn't thought of it as what you might call spiritual, in the sense that you might call, say, mindfulness meditation spiritual, if you called it that. Of course, there's this whole question of, is mindfulness meditation mere therapy, or is it spiritual, and whatever, but you know what I mean, right? I mean, I had thought of it as giving you fundamentally the benefits that just physical exercise would give you. On the other hand, I know it has ancient roots in Hindu philosophy, as does meditation, of course, Hinduism having preceded Buddhism. And so I want to get to the bottom of some of this stuff. And you teach yoga.
Right.
You've taught a lot of yoga. Well, let me ask you, which came first for you, yoga or meditation?
Which came first? I'd say actually meditation.
Mm-hmm.
But I was early days in meditation, and it was what I was doing might not even have qualified as what you would call meditation, in the sense that I was introduced to it in high school, where it was a kind of positive visualization technique in jazz band, where we would visualize ourselves playing better and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I got drawn into that. And then later got into the physical side of doing yoga. Real briefly, I think in college I was probably undiagnosed depressive, and found myself in a yoga class at one point. And after the class, noticed a dramatic change in how I felt for the better. And kind of was almost also very lost in my life at the time, and decided to pour myself into that. So I started taking classes, reading up about it, and looking into the popular books at the time. Like the big book then, and kind of still now, is BKS Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga. And that's literally what I was sort of following postures out of that book, sequences out of the book. But you made this point that it has this ancient reach back into history. And the physical side of yoga, I think you may be aware of this, because I remember you talking to Michelle Goldberg at one point.
Right. She wrote a book about a woman whose name I don't recall, who played a big role in bringing yoga to the West.
Yeah. But there's some other more historical books that have come out recently looking at the origin of postural yoga, like the stuff that we're seeing today, like the sun salutations and the flows and all the physical postures. And it turns out a lot of that stuff has nothing to do with ancient classical yoga that you'd find in, say, the Yoga Sutra or in early Hinduism. It's all stuff that was more or less grafted from Danish gymnastics in the 19th century, early 20th century, and kind of absorbed by a kind of Hindu nationalistic trend in India to strengthen the culture. So what we're seeing in yoga now is an ongoing amalgamation of all sorts of stuff.
That's funny. Just a digression. There's a kind of a parallel with meditation, because in kind of like turn of the late 19th, early 20th century, I guess it was Burma that was in reaction against colonial rule.
Yep, British imperialism.
Turned meditation into kind of a lay practice, which it hadn't generally been in Buddhism, and it isn't generally in Asian Buddhism today. But as a way of preserving the culture against colonial threat, they started encouraging lots and lots of people to meditate, and that became a thing. So it sounds like there's a little bit of a...
I think there's a direct parallel there.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Right. So where were we talking about? So in the current situation, yoga is a huge thing. It's a smorgasbord of things. And I really would broadly generally say that yoga is one of the things that's both good and probably not so good about it is that it's whatever the person wants it to be. So there's a huge dose of self-help in it. There's a huge dose of woo-woo spirituality, if you want to call it that. There's a huge dose of exercise. There's a huge dose of self-therapy.
What form does the woo take? I mean, first of all, as for the self-help is, I think, very often part of spiritual and religious movements. I mean, people join religions and spiritual movements because they help them. I mean, they don't. If your life gets worse as soon as you sign up, you don't stick with it, And so I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. And I think self-help can be the beginning of a kind of path toward deeper things. But when you say it's woo, I have a question. So what form does the woo take? Do you mean they talk vaguely about energies and act as if they can transmit them or something? And also, how big a part of yoga in America now is the woo part?
So I wouldn't even say the energy side of it is so woo.
That's one of the less woo parts.
That's one of the less woo parts. I think it comes down to the intersection between kind of a cosmological view of how the universe is and what the yoga practitioner is doing. So there's all these narratives around what the universe wants me to do, so that the universe is kind of constantly sending signals to the person, indicating what the next important step in their own evolutionary path is.
Is that part authentically Indian, or is that a Western?
I couldn't answer where it comes from. I just know that.
So a lot of people with I'm almost surprised. Yoga had seemed to me a pretty secular thing in America, but then again, I've never gone to a yoga class.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overblow this aspect of it, but it's things like that, kind of that. There's this. I would say the people that consider it more of a spiritual practice. Okay. See it as a way of clearing themselves out in a way to open themselves up for some message from beyond.
So it helps them follow their intended path, kind of.
Right. Or sometimes it can generate something that feels like an intended path.
Right. I mean intended by someone or something other than them is what I mean. The path they're in some sense meant to follow.
Right. That they're.
And the idea is during practice you get these guiding vibes, or it just if you do yoga you will be more open to the kind of valid inclinations and guides?
I think the latter.
Okay.
And I want to be careful about how heavily I speak about that, because clearly there's definitely the sort of the average garden variety person going to a yoga class is just going to chill out after work.
Right.
That's a big piece of it. I'm more in my involvement in the yoga world now is more in teacher trainings. I teach trainers how to teach, and I see this where there's more discussion around what's going on. So
you don't just teach teachers, you teach trainers how to teach teachers?
No, sorry, I teach teachers how to teach.
Okay.
For the most part.
So I'm less impressed than I was going to be, but I thought for a second it sounded like you were at the very top of the food chain. But this is still impressive. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I still have time. I've got another 40 years to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's that side of the woo. There's things around just taking care of personal. I think that's a big piece of it that I think the yogis have always been kind of hackers, biohackers, or mental hackers of some sort. So they're monkeying with their biology, trying to optimize things for, in more classical sense, deep insights into reality, whether it's perceiving the Atman and the Brahman and that whole unity thing, or otherwise. But I do think
maybe we should say that Atman is self or individual soul, and Brahman is kind of like the universal soul or something, kind of vaguely speaking. And in Indian philosophy, there's the idea that when you see things clearly, you'll realize that they're kind of one and the same, or that the line between them is illusory.
Right. So you basically, a more classical version of yoga would be, and this is going back to pre-modern yoga, but a classical version of yoga would be that you're essentially doing deep meditation practices to perceive the Atman, and your liberation is predicated on that perception or that attainment.
Perceive the Atman, perceive the individual soul, and yet ultimately the idea is it kind of merges, right, with the larger.
Well, then they're not separate. Right,
they're not separate. So you're seeing. So I mean, in a sense, if you see it in a distinct sense, that's almost not the right way to see it, right? Or am I confused? See what I mean?
I think it's a confusing concept.
Okay, we'll leave it there. So go ahead. I sidetracked us on Atman and Brahman.
But to your first question, I think I would just sort of answer that I think what yoga is depends on who's practicing and what their intentions are for it. So, it could be you can have spiritual end practices that are connecting you with something higher, more profound, and you can have a whole variety of classes that are more fitness based. Mm-hmm. You have meditative styles of practice. You have hip hop yoga classes. I mean, there's now beer yoga. There's baby goat yoga. There's all sorts of strange mutations coming up.
Okay. So let me say quickly, like the part about using it to find your authentic guidance. I think there's kind of a non-woo version of that could apply to mindfulness meditation, and even in a certain sense prayer. But I mean, with mindfulness, I think the idea is that it should help get you to a point where you can trust yourself more because you're not being misled by so many misleading feelings, by uncritically engaging in and following the guidance of feelings that are not to be trusted. So it makes your internal guidance system, in a sense, more reliable by removing some of the distorting signals you're getting from your own feelings.
Right, in theory.
I'm just saying that's a theory of it that is non-woo.
Right, but the aspect that you're describing requires that I think someone critically question their feelings, and that's the piece that I think it's a difficult thing to bring up in the yoga because it does involve formulating judgments about things, and there's if you think there's a sort of a rule about being non-judgmental in mindfulness world, I'd say that's amplified in the yoga world. Like, so any kind of criticism or critique within the yoga world sort of puts you in this, it's really bad. And it puts you in, like, you're not yogic if you have a strong opinion about something that's not, unicorns and bunny rabbits.
Right. Or that you shouldn't have strong opinions. You're allowed to.
You shouldn't have strong opinions. Yeah, exactly.
It's the one strong opinion. The first rule of Yoga Club is you can only have one strong opinion, and it's that you can't have strong opinions.
Something weird like that. But the style of yoga that I practice, it's a lesser known style. It's gaining in popularity, and this is just a small plug for it. It's called Yin Yoga, and it's contrast to
Y-I-N?
Y-I-N, like yin and yang from Chinese Taoist theory.
Taoism, yeah.
And yang practices, yang yoga styles would be kind of classified as the active, dynamic, vigorous power practices.
Or male, we might have said in an earlier, less enlightened era.
Yes.
As Taoists would have said.
The male practices. So, but in yin yoga, and this is where I think, when you ask, should you be doing yoga? This is maybe something that you might be interested in, because I got into it after I got exposed to meditation. So I started, when I met you, I started going on retreats, and I don't know if you had this experience, but I found that when I started doing meditation retreats, my body was in fierce protest around sitting still for 45 minutes at a time.
Well, there was that. There was also the sheer soreness, like day 3.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But the body just aches and pains, and the hips, knees, back, etc. And you came in and you said, well, this is par for the course, because I don't probably do yoga, and no wonder I feel this much pain. But I came in having done yoga for 8 years already. So I'm thinking, what the hell? Why am I getting this much discomfort if I'm actually doing a conscientious yoga practice? So I felt a little bit betrayed by my active yoga, and I started looking for ways to literally sit in meditation more comfortably. And I came across this style called yin yoga, which is very simple, but does prepare the body, I think, in a better way to sit more comfortably.
Okay, and so what's characteristic of yin yoga?
A few characteristics. One, nearly all the postures are on the floor. So it is a physical form
with a cushion, or actually flat on the floor?
You have a sticky mat and some blankets, and you can have cushions and bolsters and blocks and things like that. But basically, you're on the floor, and you come into an idea of a pose, and rather than moving around, rather than straining or striving to get deeper into it, you kind of relax into it, relax the muscles, and stay relatively still for upwards of 5 to 10 minutes.
And are some of these poses like things I would have trouble staying still with, like arms directly outstretched? And
no, see, that's the thing. To keep your arms outstretched, you'd have to engage your muscles. Right? So the key to this style is you put your body in a position in such a way that you don't have to use your muscles to sustain it for the most part. And you allow your body to relax with gravity into the pose, which then transmits the stress of the pose into the connective tissue around the muscle and around the joint.
So like sitting upright is an example? Because even that requires some muscular exertion.
You could sit upright if you were sitting cross-legged. In that case, you might be trying to emphasize the tissue in your hips. But there'd be a specific way of positioning your legs to target the hips in that case. But you could stay seated upright. But the bottom line is you sort of get into the pose and then let gravity and time take over. You just let your body adapt to it. But it does produce a kind of a deep layer release, which does let people sit more comfortably. And this is why I think you'd be curious about it or interested in it, is that you're there in the pose for 5 minutes or more. Not always, but usually around.
Might as well meditate.
Well, you're in a posture and you got stillness. So what do you do?
Nothing else to do.
So this is where, in the way I teach, I try to bring in the meditative side of it and have people look at both the sensations and then their mental reactions to those sensations, and sort of consider a different response to what's happening.
Okay, so is mindfulness is mindfulness part of that? It sounds like you're kind of steering toward mindfulness here, and is it part of yoga? Leave aside yin yoga. Is it part of yoga kind of broadly, at least in America?
I think a certain kind of mindfulness is broadly part of yoga in America. And again, I say this cautiously. I think the broad kind of mindfulness it's getting in is more of a body-based breath awareness.
Okay, and maybe we should stop and say, because mindfulness is thrown around so much, and some people think it just means living in the moment or something, but the foundational text, which is translated as the 4 foundations of mindfulness usually,
right,
goes through these categories of things you can be mindful of that you should pay attention to. That's the meditative practice. And one of them is the body, right?
It is, definitely. And so, yeah, if you look at that first foundation of mindfulness, you'll see the Buddha talking about being mindful in all sorts of different postures and all sorts of different activities. And I think there's a way that naturally transposes to being aware of what's going on when you're doing a practice. So whether you're doing a flow practice or a slow practice, yeah, I think there's an element of I mean, even de facto mindfulness occurring, whether the teacher's talking about it or not. If you're paying attention, if you're doing the practice and watching your breath or feeling your breath and generating your breath, you will be quote unquote mindful in a certain way.
Is watch your breath often an instruction from a yoga teacher?
It's probably if you read,
most common.
It's probably the most common. If you read yoga teacher bios, which are an interesting breed of literature, you will see most teachers say, I teach a breath-based practice. Mm-hmm. Next to alignment, next to a safe alignment practice. So you have safe alignment and breath-based practice.
Those are the two most common where safe alignment means you would be focusing mentally on your body or not?
Well, usually means placing your body in a particular position so that you would minimize any kind of risk of injury.
I see.
But it's another whole can of worms. But basically, that the alignment rules that have been largely internalized by the majority of the yoga world is based on what we're calling aesthetic alignment. So how the pose looks. Like, for example, in a pose, say a standing pose, your knee should be right over your heel, and your thigh should be parallel to the ground, or something like that. And like, there's all this whole narrative around that says, when your knee is in that 90-degree angle and just over here and not over there, then your knee is going to be safe. But turns out biomechanically that's not really accurate. It assumes everybody has the same skeleton. It assumes everybody has the same proportions and orientations of their limbs, and that's just not the case. So it's really more of a function of the way that yoga education has gone, yoga training education has gone, where people have to be onboarded very quickly and told to be able to evaluate whether a pose is safe or not simply by the way it looks. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, those are the two things: breath-based awareness and alignment. Yeah.
And maybe we should say just a tiny bit more about mindfulness for people who are not conversant, which is that probably a lot of people think of like focusing on the breath, and I think in this ancient text that I mentioned, the Satipatthana Sutta, I think that is the opening instruction. But again, then the idea is you use that as a way to stabilize your mind, kind of stop the so-called monkey mind, all the manic mind wandering, and then you focus on other things. You don't just keep focusing on the breath, maybe your body, maybe feelings, and so on. And in fact, one of the main alternatives, I met you at a so-called Vipassana retreat, which is very closely connected with mindfulness. One of the main alternative Vipassana places in the United States, it's what's the name of the Goenka? They emphasize the body scan, which is you go kind of like head to toe, focusing on how your body is feeling, after maybe starting by stabilizing the mind with the breath. But so there are different emphases even within mindfulness. Whereas where we went, IMS, you often don't hear much about body. You hear more about maybe focusing on feelings or whatever. Not that they're against the body, but it's just, in my experience, less of an emphasis.
That's interesting, because I actually think, and we could debate this, but I think there's actually a bias in both yoga world and in the Vipassana world around being mindful of the body.
Really?
Like in favor of being mindful of the body, I should say that. And I would argue that if you are successful at sustaining your attention in the present moment and quote unquote not getting lost in your thoughts, then you will be primarily connected to sensory experience, not ever really investigating other domains of the four foundations of mindfulness, like mind experiences, thoughts, any of those categories of experience you find in the fourth foundation. Those, you just don't really get into that territory, because the sustained momentum of your present moment awareness is actually interrupting and cutting off those other other layers of experience from sort of erupting or coming about. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say? Because think about it, like the retreats we've done, right? Mm-hmm. If you go on them and if you do that slow walking practice.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's like walking meditation, where you
meditation, going back and forth.
And you start out by focusing on maybe the contact of your feet on the ground, some point of, And it's true that tends to be more about the body, walking meditation.
But, so then, well, in doing the walking meditation, right, and part of the whole rationale is that if you have that lane and you have a wall at the end of it, you're not going to be able to get very lost in your mind because you'll hit the wall.
Right.
So you're constantly being within the practice, you're constantly being brought back to this embodied experience, an embodied anchor. And I think in the sitting, you've probably heard these teachings around being aware of thought but not being lost in thought.
Yeah.
And even like what you said, you establish your mind with the breath to become stable. And this is sort of why I have some issue with the way the practice is often presented, is that you first have to stabilize the mind before you can get to know the mind. And I think the very act of stabilizing the mind too much filters and influences the kind of mental experiences you have downstream from that.
Because then you can't observe the instability of the mind?
Right. Well, yeah, you get a very different read. And
with me, that's not a problem, believe me. It's always there, coming back. I don't have a problem with excessive stability in any sense. Maybe I have myself. I do think at IMS, I think if there's been a particular emphasis on any of the four, and of course I should say I've been to just a small subset of retreats at IMS, not a great variety of teachers. So this may say nothing about IMS as a whole, but I would have said that if there's one of the four foundations that is emphasized the most, it actually is feelings. But maybe I'm reading that a little of that into it because I think that's maybe the most important, because I think feelings are the things that, and this leads us a little in the direction of mindful resistance, in the sense that I think that upon close observation, you will see that feelings are the things that are making your thoughts and behavior perhaps unreliable or unwholesome, right? It's feelings steer your thoughts, they steer your behavior, and so I think an important step toward clarity and toward like good guidance is to view the feelings with non-attachment, so to speak, or however you want to say it.
Cognitive distance. Do you, when you use the word feeling, are you specifically meaning the category of experience in the
I'm
second
actually
foundation?
now using it in kind of the Western sense. In Buddhism, feeling, the thing that's usually translated as feelings does not mean emotions per se. It just means the more kind of elemental dimension of like positive or negative affect or neutral, according to Buddhist philosophy, although I've never really understood what a neutral feeling would feel like. But
how does your earlobe feel right now? Your left earlobe?
Well, not at all. But if my left earlobe.
This is the example I've heard given.
Yeah. I'm getting there. Give me a second.
Did you meditate today? This shouldn't be taking so long.
I did. And by the way, one thought I've had just the last couple of days is I've realized that one thing I do, I'm not that great at focusing on my breath, but one thing that sometimes works is like, forget about the breath, just pay attention to whatever is most salient. And it may well be a bodily sense. Like if you're having trouble focusing on your breath at the beginning, and it's like, I want to focus on this breath, and I can't do it. Here I am, here is the breath, I can't do it. Sometimes if you just relax and say, well, what is the most salient thing I feel? And maybe it's a feeling in your body, or maybe it's a sound. The most salient perceptual thing. I find that alone helps quiet the mind enough that then you can kind of back into the breath if you do want to focus on the breath. You're just like, oh yeah, there's this sound. Oh, and there's this feeling in my body, and oh, my body is kind of going up and down. Oh, that's my breath. And then it's like sometimes a single-minded focus on focusing on your breath is not, to my mind, the way to do it. Anyway, that was just a breath, physical feeling segue.
Well, and this is coming back to the question of yoga. You asked about how mindfulness is integrated there, and I would say majority of, again, I can say this carefully, but the majority of the yoga world probably sees mindfulness as a way of you're present to body and breath and sounds and that kind of thing. But if you're thinking or you're aware of your thinking, you're kind of getting distracted. There's a lot of talk about being distracted and not being mindful when those other conditions are happening. But I've tried to, in my own teaching at least, tried to bring in more of those other elements of the Satipatthana Sutta and bring in awareness of thought, awareness of feelings as you're describing. And I've inverted it now, just to segue off or pivot off what you were just saying around focusing on the breath at first being kind of a challenging thing to do. I actually discourage it now. Mm-hmm. So I say if you just relax within what's going on and start with more open-ended Vipassana, open awareness style practice, you'll find at times your mind kind of lands and as you're describing this natural ebb and flow of a bodily breath experience, and you just settle into it more easily. Mm-hmm. To use technical,
if direct focus on the breath is working, fine. But I almost everyone I know who has meditated for very long finds that the nature of the challenges change over time, the experience changes over time, and what was working for a while may quit working, and so it's just good to be open-minded, I think.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So the question, though, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about with mindful resistance was...
Wait, before we get there, let's get there, but first... go ahead and plug your stuff. Do you have like a place people can go to?
Yeah, they can check out my website. It's my name, joshsummers.net. And I do have a kind of what I call mini podcast that goes out every few weeks, which is a short reflection on some aspect of yin yoga, whether it's the meditative stuff.
And it's got a good name. What's the name?
Well, the name was inspired by one of your other guests, Stephen Batchelor, and the name is Everyday Sublime. So it's, in Batchelor's view, which I kind of am sympathetic to, is that the sublime is not found in some transcendent state, or deep state of absorption. It's in the everyday experience that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I think he's kind of relatedly, he uses a term, because he's, of course, the person with whom the phrase secular Buddhism is perhaps most closely associated. He had a book called Buddhism Without Beliefs. But in any event, I think partly by way of emphasizing how even if he's in favor of a very non-woo version of Buddhism, that doesn't mean that the experience can't be almost magical. I think he used the term re-enchantment, the re-enchantment of the world or something, along with Everyday Sublime. But anyway, that's that. Okay, so that's where...
Well, yeah, and in your own writing, at least it's come through in the book that you recently published, the way you looked at that, you had your whole perceptual frame around that weed in the back of IMS and how that changed, and seeing that.
This was not marijuana. This was an actual literal weed growing in the ground. You
weren't smoking weed then?
I was not. It was I'll tell you, the kind of experience I had was, you might think I had been. The experience was to see a weed that I had always hated, and all of a sudden have the perception that it was as beautiful as everything else in the forest. And I argue that what I was doing was no longer seeing essence of weed, which gets to an important Buddhist concept called emptiness. The idea that the essences that we project essences onto things in very subtle ways. It isn't just a cognitive matter of labeling something the weed. It actually the category shapes our perception in a very subtle way and infuses the perception with a certain feeling in ways we don't usually notice. But anyway, that's the weed story you're alluding to. And yeah, the weed suddenly looked sublime, you could say, and it was there for the noticing. And I hadn't been noticing it.
Did you feel an affinity towards the weed, though?
When you talk to people who say, these very adept meditators who say that emptiness is kind of part of the way, emptiness or formlessness Like a teacher we both sat with, Rodney, uses the term formless, and I've talked to him about this, and I've talked to other people who say they go around seeing the world with this kind of so-called emptiness, formlessness, whatever. They generally report that everything's got a positive vibe. I mean, it's a positive thing, and that's why emptiness is a misleading term. They might describe a kind of energy, a feeling that there's almost an energy exuded by things or a beauty to things, but I didn't feel a particular affinity for the weed. That's the whole point, is if you're not seeing essence in anything, it's all equal in its attractiveness in some sense. I mean, I wouldn't carry that too far, but there's an equalizing tendency. The sharp disjuncture there had been between weed and non-weed, where one was a positive perception of a plant and one was a negative, that was gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this might be a segue into what you're up to now, but because the question is, if one is capable of shaping their perception to no longer see these kinds of distinctions and see kind of everything imbued with a positive, a quality of positivity, do you think that's actually advantageous, particularly in kind of the political climate we're in?
Yeah, well, I think in the realm of human affairs, what that translates to is next time you see a bitter rival or enemy, you would not feel essence of bitter rival or enemy. And I think the way human cognition is like designed by natural selection, and I think dealing with enemies and allies is part of the design. I mean, we're built to make those distinctions. I think given the mental equipment we're dealing with, if that essence of enemy kind of dissolves, I think it allows you to have a clearer view of the person, an actually clearer understanding of what they're actually up to. Because I think the way the enemy category works is, and there's evidence of this, is that it leads us to, for example, when the person does something bad, we see that as flowing from their disposition because they're a bad person. When they do something good, we explain it away as a special circumstance. They were just showing off or whatever. So that's an example of how I think the perception of essence warps your comprehension of what's actually motivating people. And I think, to bring it into the political arena, I think an essentialist attitude toward Trump followers, like they're all racist or they're all xenophobic or they're all anything else, or just they're all bad, similarly distorts what is in truth a much more complex picture, which is that, first of all, different Trump supporters are motivated by different things, and it's a great variety of things. And the trouble with essentialism, and I say the same thing about the war on terror, the trouble with like radical Islamic fundamentalism being this kind of like force that inhabits people, is it just discourages analysis of the kind that can help you solve the problem. It discourages you from looking at so-called root causes or asking, well, what is it about the environment that led to this, and so on.
Yeah, it discourages looking at the complexity of it, or various dynamics that may be going on, and sort of establishes a one-to-one linear connection between things. Like, for example, with Islam, it's like there's this doctrine in a text that has a direct correlate to behavior. So therefore, that's the problem, nothing else.
Right. It is a form of essential. I think essentialist views of all religions are just analytically wrong. I mean, if you just look at the variety of forms of expression any religion has, it's just very hard to say what the essence of the religion is, even if there are core teachings that maybe you hope will emerge and often emerge under certain circumstances, or teachings you hope won't and sometimes do. But anyway, the mindful resistance idea, this is part of the idea, is it grew out of the idea that the so-called resistance to Trump and Trumpism is, in my view, sometimes just kind of counterproductive in the form it takes. And
so what would be an example of counterproductive resistance? Well,
essentializing is one form, is when people say, they're all just racists or they're all just anything else.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of perception that I think does tend to be eroded by the practice of mindfulness. I mean, even if you don't have the dramatic kind of experience I had with that weed, I think mindfulness can break down the tendency to essentialize. And the other, in a way, a more accessible example is just the idea that I think, and this is becoming, I think, a fairly commonplace view, that sometimes opponents of Trump and Trumpism overreact to what he does, and sometimes what he does is maybe an intentional provocation precisely because overreacting helps him. The overreacting often helps the narrative that he's selling his base, which is that he's persecuted, everyone hates him, the media is unfair. So I think just getting outraged without any reflection on your outrage and without deciding whether to follow the initial impulse of outrage can do him a favor. And of course, mindfulness involves being aware enough of feelings to reflect on them and decide whether you want to follow them. And I think if you look at specific, things that like, for example, spread fake news on both sides and just exacerbate the tribalism, because again, fake news ultimately plays into Trump's narrative. When he can point to a false story that has been spread, that's a victory for him. And I think we've all been complicit in spreading fake news, at least I have, in the sense of, like, you see something on Twitter, a report that reflects unfavorably on Trump, say, and you retweet it or like it without actually investigating whether it's true. And the reason you do that is because you so want it to be true, because it's unflattering information about the enemy tribe. You know, if you look at, I mean, this is technically called confirmation bias, where information that seems to support a pre-existing view we cling to, and information that doesn't support the view we either investigate very critically or just forget. And if you pay attention to what's happening when confirmation bias works, I think you'll see that feelings are what's driving it. You have a positive feeling about that information, an urge to share it. And so I think, mindfulness meditation can dilute that. Now,
so just to recap, your basic concern is that the tribalism, us versus them psychology is going to get reinforced by outrage and indignation against Trump and things like Trumpism.
Yeah, I mean, I have a concern about tribalism broadly.
Right.
I had a concern about the psychology of tribalism in human affairs before Trump came along. I do think that it is the problem in the world, whether it's conflict between nations or sectarian conflict abroad or whatever. It's a known set of cognitive biases, typically activated by feelings, that help start and sustain the conflict. So it's a generic problem in my mind, and Trump is one example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I should say, on the one hand, I want to emphasize that I think both sides are part of the problem. Both sides are evincing the psychology of tribalism. That said, Trump's own ideology is particularly tribalistic in certain particular ways that I find particularly dangerous, like ethnic tribalism and so on. I find particularly worrisome. But right now, I think the psychology of tribalism is found on both sides of the American divide.
Right, and you, it sounds like you're just, I mean, on one level, you're trying to advocate for a pause button.
Well, wisdom, it isn't just a timeout. It's a more like micro timeouts. Like if we all do little timeouts before reacting to things, I just think that leads to wiser, more well-considered behavior.
And I guess what's the end? My question around that is, what's the end game? In the sense that, yeah, it will. You think it's going to decrease the divide, but the looming fear in my mind is, like, how does that engage the legitimate bad things that are occurring?
Well, I don't think you should lose sight of those. And I mean, certainly, we do this mindful resistance newsletter. We certainly emphasize, but we don't I mean, there's a section at the beginning called The Week in Trump, and we summarize like kind of.
Actually, why don't you pause for a second and just describe the newsletter for people that may not be aware of it yet?
Okay, so if you go to mindfulresistance.net, there will be an invitation to subscribe. If you just Google Mindful Resistance, you'll get there, because the only other prominent hit is the piece I wrote for Vox about mindful resistance. So one way or another, you'll get. So it's a weekly newsletter we put out, and we
meaning you.
Well, no, I have help. I mean, the names are at the bottom. Okay. I mean, I am, I'm in the end, I'm the one editing it, and it's certainly more my voice than others, but particularly, but if I write an out and out like little essay in it, I put my name at the bottom, in addition to my name being at the bottom of the whole newsletter with a bunch of other people. But anyway, so the Week in Trump is at the top of the newsletter, is meant to be, it's a summary. Like, first of all, it gives you permission to spend the week away from social media and the news, because we claim that we will have everything truly important about Trump you need to know there.
And I've been utilizing that feature of it.
Good. It's an underappreciated aspect of it, I think. But the things you're talking about, that kind of the really bad things, like if there's some amendment, well, the things I consider bad, like if there's some significant change in policies of immigration enforcement, like in the last newsletter, we just noted that one thing that's, I think, happened under Trump, we've just found this thing to link to, noting that the percentage of immigrants who are detained who have not committed crimes, or who are deported maybe, who have not committed crimes, has gone up. Now, that's just a fact, I mean, that you can consider for your consideration. But my point is that we're not losing sight of the things that at least I personally find unfortunate about Trump. It's not, on the one hand, it's not a super ideological thing. And the newsletter itself doesn't take formal positions on gun control and so on. But it's motivated by the idea that the Trumpism is activating some unfortunate human impulses and has some unfortunate tendencies, including, authoritarian tendencies, at least rhetorically, and things like that. So we're not, the idea, I mean, in a way, it sounds like you're getting at this often asked question about Buddhism, like, if you get too close to enlightenment, will you quit making judgments about things, right? Well, right. I'm not that close. I don't know many people who are. That's not a concern. In my experience, the bigger concern is maintaining enough equanimity to act wisely and effectively on your values, right? And
that's where the rubber hits the road. Is that if you are in a state of relative equanimity, you're not having these knee-jerk reactions. What is a wiser response?
Well, first of all, do no harm. Don't react to Trump in ways that galvanize his base. I mean, unless, at least ask yourself, to the extent that this kind of reaction that we're doing is going to activate his base. Let's take when he said, I want a military parade. And we all kind of freaked out. It's like, I'm not saying it's not worth freaking out. There are some authoritarian vibes there. On the other hand, JFK had a military parade at his inauguration and so on. But the main point I want to call attention to is be aware of how that's being perceived in Trump land, which is you don't like the military. There are so many cases where our reaction to Trump is not being perceived the way we may think we intend it. It is not being perceived by Trump supporters. So for starters, I just think people should be aware of those. Right? It's just information you can use. It's like, or the NRA thing about, and I didn't get this at first. I didn't understand until I engaged Ross Douthat on Twitter, the New York Times columnist, and I had a dialogue with him. I didn't understand that, asking rental car companies or airlines to quit giving discounts to NRA members Whereas to me, it seems just like be even-handed. You're not giving discounts to people who are in favor of gun control. Why give them to people who are against gun control? But Ross, I think correctly noted that the way a lot of gun owners perceive this is it's a form of stigma. We just want to stigmatize them and say that people who own guns are bad. So it's important to understand that's how these things are being perceived. That by itself doesn't tell you whether or not your reaction is worth it, but at least factor it into the cost-benefit analysis. And this gets at something that is actually hasn't, I think, been resolved in terms of the evolving identity of the newsletter, which is that you don't have to meditate to understand everything I just said. You don't even have to meditate to act on it. I do think that mindfulness meditation may make you less inclined to follow your kind of reactive impulses uncritically. But the newsletter is not just for meditators. And this is something of an issue because a lot of people came to it by virtue of hearing me talk about Buddhism or something. But I don't want to, and I think that should be an element. Those resources should be there for people who are into meditation or want to take it up. But it is not only for those people. There is a plain English meaning of mindfulness. It's just like, pay attention, which. Right.
Well, and I think, it sounds like you're, even beyond just mindfulness, you're kind of trying to inculcate a cognitive habit of, call it metacognition, or call it a trend of cognitive empathy, trying to see things from other perspectives.
Well, that is the meaning of cognitive empathy. It's a term that's in use to distinguish it from the emotional empathy of like feeling people's pain.
Yep.
To exercise cognitive empathy, you don't have to care about the person at all. But you at least accurately you understand how they're processing the information. You understand their perspective. Now, metacognition, I think, is a term I may have first heard from you. So you tell me. But I think about it. I think of it as being more broadly awareness of the way your mind is, in a way, awareness of the way your own mind is working, awareness of the feelings that are steering your thoughts, and so on.
Right. And so if I still come back to so then what does somebody do? Where does somebody go with this?
Well, like I said, first do no harm. I mean, I think really, honestly, not overreacting when overreaction is counterproductive. That's a good thing. Then secondly, use, if you, once you've quit, naively assuming that all Trump voters are just bad people, period, then maybe you can start investigating the things that actually gave rise to support for Trump, and think carefully about what to do about them if you're not a Trump fan. And here I have to admit I think the newsletter has kind of fallen down on the job because on the one hand I want to say there has not been. I mean, when Trump was first elected, there was a lot of some discussion of the kind of mega forces underlying it. Like it's a reaction against globalization. It's a nationalist backlash against cosmopolitan elites who are invested in globalization, for example. Or it's a reaction to the loss of jobs via trade. Or, and I don't, you might think that where that leads to people who don't think Trump is healthy, whether they're Democrats or Republican, you might think that where that leads is to an analysis, like saying, well, okay, is that it? Are people losing their jobs? Is it trade or is it more automation? And in any event, what would you do about it? Or like, or with globalization, yeah, it is true that a lot of urban cosmopolitan elites may feel as much an affinity for people in Europe who share their values as they do for fellow Americans. That's an actual thing. Is that inevitable? Is it, and so on. So I think it would be healthy to ask all these kinds of questions, but I don't see them really being asked now. And then the mea culpa is I don't think we've done as good a job in the newsletter as we could, nearly as good, of drawing people's attention to what arenas there are where people are asking those questions and addressing them. Like, what are the actual roots of Trumpism? Mm-hmm. It's not unrelated to what's happening in Europe with these right-wing kind of ethno-nationalist parties. And to what extent is it immigration and so on? But that's, in answer to your question, first, do no harm. If Trumpism is a cause you don't approve of, try not to react in ways that help it, that consolidate his base. And then, in theory, if you have become less reactive in the course of doing that, you should be better equipped to explore, what are the root causes? What are policies that might address them? I
guess I'm trying to think of specific actions are there specific types of actions you would prefer to see people taking when they're not sort of reacting blindly to their feelings? So, non-action is one, right?
Let me give you an example. Of again, the newsletter has no ideology, so we don't say we're in favor of, we per se are in favor of gun control. But there is a section called News You Can Use where, last couple of weeks when it's been in the air, we have said, if you're into gun control, here are some things, here are some rallies that are being held, or so on. But elsewhere in the newsletter, I did try to make one distinction. I did it. I didn't explicitly editorialize, but I made a distinction in this general area of gun issues, and it was kind of as follows: that there's on the one hand kind of lobbying to get people who are giving discounts to NRA members to quit doing that, and my feeling is that. I can totally see that. You might want to be aware that it has backlash potential. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But there's another category of things that people are advocating, like they're also putting pressure on Apple and Amazon to drop the NRA channel, which is a TV thing. I didn't quite say explicitly what I'm about to say, but I hoped it would be implicit in the way I presented this, because it was after I talked about the fact that you should realize the way this is being perceived by gun owners is that we hate them and want to stigmatize them. Okay, I do think there's a distinction, if that's your concern, between trying to get airlines and rental car companies to just adopt a position of balance. Okay, which is you don't give subsidies to either gun control opponents or supporters. A distinction between that and saying to Amazon and Apple, we want you to just remove the channels that are subscribed to by this category of people, but don't remove any of our channels. That's a different. I think that is that's a distinction between a.
So a symmetrical policy versus a stigmatizing policy.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, and let me ask you something. Have you seen anybody make that distinction? Anywhere on Twitter or Facebook? Say, wait a second. What's that?
Wasn't it implicit in the mindfulness newsletter? Mindful resistance
Well,
newsletter?
That's where you might have seen it. The distinction was made, but that's my point. It's like Twitter, it is just so governed by tribal outrage that people are not likely, that to really discuss that kind of distinction between those two things. On the one, those two forms of activism. So if you ask what can people do, I think we've at least made a distinction between a form of activism that may have greater costs and be less defensible logically, and one that may have some of those costs, but is more defensible logically, and by virtue of that may have less of those costs. I don't know if that, I don't have any magic solution. I'm just saying, can we go issue by issue and try to look at this as clearly as we can? And the current social media climate is just not conducive to that.
Right. not just the social media, it's the political climate. I mean, the identity politics.
No,
climate,
right. I mean, social media, but social media, because, I mean, when I was your age, I know exactly, but sometime in my past, you just did not have the option to broadcasting a reaction to news you had just gotten. There just wasn't a way to do it. So you had to reflect more. So, social media is a particularly challenging part of the environment, I think.
I would agree with that. With who, I guess the other question I was curious about with the newsletter is like, who's your intended audience?
Well, this is the challenge. I think, like I said, I think there are people who came there from a tradition of meditation, including maybe some people who just kind of wanted almost a shelter from the storm. You know, it's just like this whole thing is freaking us out so much. And I do hope it helps there, because like the Week in Trump, it's not just everything you need to know, but I try to present it in a calm and sometimes lighthearted fashion. I mean, I think it's better to almost have an element of absurdism in the way you look at the current situation than to get so wrapped up in it that you can't think straight. So I do think this is it's like a safe space for absorbing news about Trump. So that's one thing. But like I said, I think there is. Is there anyone on the right, like any Trump supporters that have responded to it? Are they picking up on it at all? I haven't gotten much blowback from that. I mean, I think I would like to think that it's useful to never Trump Republicans, and I worry that maybe my own ideology inevitably creeps into it. I try to limit that because it's not meant to be partisan. I mean, I think Trump is and there are a number of conservatives who feel that he's just a challenge to the whole system right now. Sure.
Do you have any sense of the direction that the newsletter will be going? Like, will it be formed into a podcast at some point? Will it get picked up by some larger publication?
We've thought about. Some of the pieces, its elements have been picked up. So, like a piece I wrote that was just in the newsletter, Vox asked to reprint, and they reprinted. A piece I wrote about the Florida school shooting ran in Tricycle a couple of days later, the Buddhist website. We may, whether we have regular arrangements, like maybe a regular home for the Week in Trump might be something that could happen. And in addition to being in the newsletter, it might be on some site if there was interest in that. But and a podcast is something we've thought about. But it's I'm genuinely trying to get guidance from readers, and we're getting more of it. I mean, like, for example, one person wrote in and said, "I want to start a mindful resistance chapter." I'm like,
in Madison, right?
Yeah, and I'm like, well, okay, can you explain to us what that would be? But I'm encouraging. We found it turns out there's another reader in Madison, and so we put them in touch. And we've heard from people in a few areas who express similar things. So there could be meetups. There aren't yet, but there could be.
Do you want to brag about your numbers at all? What kind of numbers are you looking at?
With subscription is now in the vicinity of 7,000. It's we started it, I guess, about.
Whoa, we talked 2 weeks ago, and it was at 3, I think.
No, that wasn't 2 weeks ago. That was maybe you have access to the number of people who actually open it. Mm-hmm. So that might have been that number or something in that vicinity a couple of weeks ago. My dog is barking, so this conversation may not be long for this world. He's right outside my door, but it's grown, kind of steadily. Every week there's been net growth, even after unsubscribes. People can unsubscribe, and so the average growth has been about 1,000 a month. And it's not completely. There's been growth every week. Some weeks you get a big bump for some reason. So we'll see. If this keeps up, if the growth keeps up, then it would seem to be worth doing. And.
Well, I hope to bring more profile for you in the yoga world. I will say, every time I mention your name in the yoga context, people say, "Oh, I know him. He was the former Secretary of Labor."
I have a story about that. Anyway,
and so
that's right. Reich. Yes,
right. So I don't know if you ever considered changing your name, just for.
When we were both on the masthead of the New Republic, that was actually a problem. I got the occasional phone call for him. I once actually spent 15 minutes being interviewed before we both realized they thought they were interviewing the Secretary of Labor.
But, if the interviewer had only let go of their attachment to essence,
they would have known. There's no such thing as a Robert Wright or a Robert Reich, so I might as well keep interviewing this guy.
Right.
So anyway, we've gone kind of long. It would be self-indulgent of me to continue much longer, although I love talking about this stuff, and I appreciate your indulging me. But yes, do indoctrinate all yoga students
I am.
In mindful resistance.
Every workshop, I mention it now.
But back to your
because
things. Yeah.
Because I mean this. I think that because in the yoga world there is a tendency to feel like you can't have strong opinions or engage in critical analysis of things too much. I think there's a kind of a vacuum of discourse and a vacuum of leadership around thinking through these things wisely. So I think, if someone's willing to subscribe, they will get that from what you're putting out, or get a sense of it.
Well, good. We welcome the throng of yoga practitioners who, even as I speak, are rushing to sign up for the newsletter. I
will be, I will preach it and spread it.
I appreciate that. And I do appreciate your indulging this, but get back to your own self-promotion just briefly. Remind people again. I mean, first of all, you have a Twitter handle, right?
Yeah, I'm not too active on Twitter for the reasons you mentioned. The Twitter handle, I think it's included under the links on this site.
It is on the site, but some people see these on YouTube now.
Oh, right. Middleway Josh.
And there's an audio podcast as well, so why don't you spell it out?
Everyday Sublime is the audio podcast. Everyday, one word, Sublime.
And then the Twitter handle is, you still show up there a little, right?
Yeah, Middleway Josh is the Twitter.
Middleway Josh.
Yeah.
And anything else, Facebook or?
Josh Summers on Facebook, but there's a few of us out there, so make sure you pick the one with the right
URL,
with the right essence.
You have the Josh Summers URL, right?
Josh.net, yeah.
.net. Okay. So you are a meta yoga teacher, the teacher of teachers.
Well, that, but it's more people that are interested in what you're doing.
Okay.
Who are interested in meditation. I would say if you're looking for a yogic complement to that practice, the yin yoga would be a really good way to explore.
So you are willing to teach just regular students. You don't mean to confine your teaching to teachers, even though you teach teachers.
Right. That's where I do more like a short workshop on a weekend or something.
Okay. So people can approach you and seek your sage guidance.
They will be likely just to be disappointed, but yes.
Well, then your guidance. Let's just make it your guidance.
My guidance, yeah, sure.
You're not necessarily reliable guidance.
So, Bob, when are you going on a retreat again?
I was just thinking I really need to sign up for one. It's been a year, and the last one I did was the first one, and it was not at IMS, and it was in the more kind of in the Shambhala tradition, although not officially. So, I was just thinking about that. I got to sign up for either IMS per se or maybe at the IMS-related forest refuge. So maybe I'll see you there. When is your next retreat?
Early December.
So you're set. Is this the Narayan, the formerly known as Narayan Rodney retreat?
Yes, I think. The rumor is Rodney's retiring.
That's what I heard. At this point, we probably should go ahead and actually end the conversation. But and then talk offline. I mean, unless
people out of their
all those people who know who Rodney is can email us and we'll talk. But thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
And I encourage people to seek your guidance.
Thanks for your work too.
Okay. Bye.